Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, she, they, and this is Literally Graphic. And today I'm doing something tag adjacent, and I'm just going to try and outline and talk about how I review things. Give you a peek behind the scenes, as it were. Because, as you've probably noticed, I almost only ever do reviews, certainly not the most popular thing on BookTube, and a daunting task. But it makes me happy, and I feel more engaged with my reading, so there's that. And that's not to say my reviews have always been the same. Casting ourselves back in time to just under 6 years ago, when I started this channel off, I mostly just turned on the camera and started talking about each book. Sometimes I would write some thoughts for the Goodreads, but it was easy to not do that. That said, the editing burden for those videos was pretty high, and I often felt like I was forgetting to say different things and not getting to the point in any sort of timely way. That said, being on screen did sort of force me to accept different things about myself that I used to be more bothered by. Fast forward to the start of 2019, and I decided to take a short break and then change things up. I generally refer to this as the Great Channel Reset. Many things changed, including my review style. The biggest change as relates to my review process was I started writing scripts. This was not only to finally overcome this regret I kept feeling that I was not saying all the things I wanted to, but also because I was becoming more aware of the importance of closed captioning, which following a script certainly makes easier to produce. That said, this introduced a whole new set of anxieties because I've been told my whole life that my grammar is trash, and I specifically wanted to do video content to avoid this weakness. Apparently, this isn't too surprising considering I have ADHD, but I was only diagnosed as an adult. Plus, knowing is only half the battle, and I apologize for any crap grammar present in my captions. Between 2019 and now, some things have stayed the same, but many things have slowly but steadily shifted. I developed a bullet point list of things I wanted to cover in each review. Some stick, some don't. Having this jumping off point also helps me get the ball rolling whenever I sit down to a new review because I'm not starting from scratch. At this moment, the list looks like this. Since I generally just copy and paste this into the captions, it also includes some notes about the music and my outro that are part of my video template. Kicking things off with the book information makes sense. I don't always mention publisher and publication date, but it's an ideal. The reading challenges subpoint was something I did more back in the day. It doesn't come up as much anymore. As far as the content notes point, inspired by a mixture of my puritanical upbringing and for my growing understanding of trigger warnings, although not saying trigger warnings are puritanical, those are very separate points, I ultimately decided not to call these things trigger warnings, however, because A, those are a specific thing that I don't feel like I could do 100% justice to, and B, I sometimes want to flag things not for trigger-related reasons. After that, I also recently decided to elaborate further on the nature of violence being depicted. Obviously, there are many different kinds of violence, and in this spot I generally talk about the most obvious physical kinds. This is probably because I was raised in a culture that thought depictions of violence were okay when the depiction of pleasure was not, and so I think about that a lot. There's a lot of ways people are impacted by more easily ignored kinds of violence, and I should try and highlight that more. Then I try and flesh out the different creators a bit more. When I review comics from the big two, this section gets very long. Another relatively recent addition is listing keywords. Ideally, I would love to write all of my own story synopses, but I generally don't. So adding this keywords part was my way of inserting more of what I feel like happened in the book and was important, but without, ideally, giving away spoilers. Describing if a book is a character, plot, or setting sort of story is something in the outline that I generally don't talk about, but remains because it sounds like a good idea. Theme is something that sometimes comes up and sometimes doesn't. It mostly boils down to if I can think of something. I'm not always insightful enough to find the themes, and sometimes I bring it up in a lot of other ways, so don't feel like it needs to be highlighted again here. I need to come up with a better word to use here than wordiness. It sounds very judgy, but the quality of the writing, the breaking up of the writing across the page, and sometimes even the fonts used, are very important to talk about. Do you have any suggestions? Describing the art is pretty self-explanatory. I feel like I used to be more picky when it came to the style of art in comics, but now I'm pretty open to all kinds of creative expression. Superhero comics are probably the books that I still dislike the art in most often. Part of that is being created on a faster schedule than most other publications. But there's also just trends in superhero comics that I don't appreciate. Example, hypermuscular men and vacuum-sealed latex on anyone? Major influences generally doesn't come up. I'm not sure why, but while I see it as a given point to put in a review outline, I just don't feel confident trying to pin them down either. Who are the good guys versus who are the bad guys is something that generally comes up in books that I disagree with. I haven't been reading as many of those of late, so this point doesn't come up very much. Getting closer to the end of this outline, I promise. The next 4 points were added very deliberately and often feel the most charged and important. I decided I wanted to talk about how gender, sexuality, race, class, and ability/disability were treated in every single book I read because I wanted to highlight just how often these intersections are ignored or painted over. Not that every book has to include positive and diverse representation along each of these points of difference, although I feel like comics present a fairly easy way to integrate a lot of diversity. But I was even more uncomfortable only talking about these intersections when creators included them in a way obvious enough that I noticed. Plus, having to think about these things means my thoughts develop and I pay more attention when I'm listening to people talk about their experiences living and consuming media while existing at these intersections. Clearly, I'm not an expert on most of these intersections, so I do try and write my reviews in a way that encourages taking these and all of my other opinions with a grain of salt. The "does this connect with other stuff" point is not generally where I actually end up talking about this, but it's a good reminder to try and connect it with other books I've reviewed. This also feels much less intimidating than trying to list influences. And I conclude with the star rating. I didn't always have this bullet point, but since I do generally give things star ratings, it seemed a bit silly to not include it in every review. As far as how I give out my stars, starting from the top, I am one of those people who really needs that extra push to give a book 5 out of 5 stars. A lot of books I read and really enjoy do end up with 4 out of 5 stars because it doesn't take me that extra mile to make it feel special. That said, I'm also one of those people who sees 3 out of 5 stars as a good rating. For better or for worse, 3 out of 5 stars is often a go-to rating for me, and I have a bit of a hang-up on going much lower, unless I feel the book is bad. I don't want to rate books 2 stars for being aimed at a different audience or not being my taste. 2 stars is usually reserved for something that I do feel fails on a number of levels, but has some good qualities. 1 out of 5 stars is something for works that I feel are pretty bad and usually offensive. Then I have my outro, which communicates some different values I have as a leftist and helps me not feel like I'm just dropping off at the end. As a watcher of videos, I would highly recommend that everyone include some sort of thing after they finish talking, as this gives me, at least, a chance to pause my watch later playlist and write up a comment. Sometimes if videos end right after the person finishes talking, things move on before I get a chance to realize I should comment. Land acknowledgements are obviously not the be-all, end-all of the decolonizing efforts I, or anyone else, should be part of. But I do still think that a specific and anti-colonizer land acknowledgement is a valuable facet of a bigger picture. I try and reword the acknowledgement every year so it doesn't get too rote and I can emphasize different things. I also try and pick up, read, and review comics by people indigenous to so-called North America on a regular basis, and do local IRL activism. Bye y'all, keep reading and resist white supremacy. And as always, Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, non-Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.